Hello, I'm Bret and you're watching The Defining Moment for Creating the Culture of Conscience. Our guest today is Dr. Antonio Betancourt. Dr. Betancourt is the Director of Government Relations with the Universal Peace Federation in Washington, D.C. He's also Executive Director of both the Summit Council for World Peace and the Association for the Unity of Latin America. Dr. Betancourt is President of the World Institute for Development and Peace, which is dedicated to advancing economic justice and democratization. Antonio Betancourt is married to Kyoko Funayama, and together they have 4 children. In July of 2007, he and his wife will celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary. Dr. Antonio Betancourt, it's my distinct honor and great pleasure to welcome you to The Defining Moment. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule and fly out here to California from Washington to be our guest today and really delve into issues which I know are of vital importance to the stability of our world. Thank you so much for coming here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Our topic today is resolving the North Korean nuclear issue. Dr. Betancourt, you visited North Korea 17 times in order to facilitate high-level dialogue with top-level government officials in North Korea. You've met face-to-face with the late President Kim Il-sung of North Korea on 5 occasions. And you've met with Kim Jong-il, the current president of North Korea, twice. The purpose of all your work in North Korea has been to forward diplomatic efforts to promote peace and stability in Northeast Asia. Before we delve into today's very meaningful topic, I want to ask you to share a defining moment from your own life and your experience in dealing with North Korea. Could you share a defining moment for us?
Perhaps the most crucial defining moment was after months of trying to get a visa to get to North Korea. And finally, I was able to go there as representative, as a special envoy of Sun Myung Moon, of Reverend Moon, and the unification movement. A movement that for 40 years has been at war with North Korea. The most crucial and defining moment for me was to be sitting with the late Kim Jong-un, Secretary General of the Workers' Party of Korea, the third most powerful person in the nation, in the country, and to be the recipient of an enormous grievances and vile and against me, against my leader, against the U.S., and for me to, since I had no experience in dealing with North Korea, in dealing with this particular mindset, there was a moment in which I felt, why did I come here? I felt I have failed, that this was totally futile. These people are so passionate, negative towards our movement, towards Reverend Moon, towards myself being there. So I saw no hope. But then suddenly I remember the teachings of Father Moon, that I have to love my enemy, that I have to defuse this bomb that was in front of me, and that this unfolding was for me to control it by the power of true love, by the power of unconditional love taught by Reverend Moon. So I decided silently, mentally, as I was looking and watching, as I'm watching you now,
Yes.
Secretary Kim Jong-un, with his, all the complaints that he had against us, against the U.S., against the West, all the historical grievances of what he perceived to be the injustice against him, against his leader, against North Korea and against the people and so forth. I began to feel a feeling of peace in my heart. and that I have to take a parental, kind of an elder brother, even though we were basically of the same age, an elder brother position, and just patiently listen. And then a little voice was telling me, don't worry, this is just posturing. This is just letting all the poison out. Let the poison out patiently. Don't engage him, just listening. And a miracle happened. You know, after a while, he was ready to ask me, why are you here? That was a defining moment. Because at that moment, I felt I can fulfill what I came here to do. That was in April of 1991, and in November 30th of 1991, Reverend and Mrs. Moon entered into North Korea to reconcile with the leader and the regime that had imprisoned Reverend Moon in a concentration camp in Hunnam in 1949. If you don't call that a defining moment, then what is?
Beautiful testimony. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's really wonderful. What role did the United States play at the end of World War II in dividing the Korean Peninsula into two distinct states, which has come to represent one of the very last vestiges of the Cold War, and which has become one of the biggest thorns in the side of the American government?
The Americans make serious mistakes in the 1940s. Perhaps they took the Soviet Union too seriously as a partner for peace, because the Soviet Union did become a partner in fighting Hitler and fighting the Nazis. So at the conclusion of all that turmoil of the Second World War, the U.S., as a Christian nation with Christian democratic values, was the most powerful nation on earth then as it is today. Today, in 2006. It was the most powerful nation. It could have Stalin, agree with everything the U.S. wanted. But the U.S. was confused, and they wanted to play the good guy and appeal to the good heart of the Soviet Union and call them to become partners in building the new world, without realizing that the objectives of the Soviet Union, the interest of the Soviet Union, were far distant from the objectives of the United States. So the division of the Korean Peninsula was part of these mistakes that they made. They totally underestimated the cunning, the capacity for mendacity and lying of Stalin, and therefore the movement that was at that time working for the liberation of Korea from the Japanese occupation, which was the movement of Kim Il-sung. So, those mistakes are still today to be addressed and to be undone.
Okay, good. Thank you. I appreciate that. You've traveled to North Korea and met with the high-ranking North Korean officials on many occasions. What is it that North Korea hopes to achieve by developing nuclear weapons?
Kim Il-sung was very clear that they cannot feed nuclear weapons or nuclear energy to their population. So he was asking us to use our influence to give them nuclear technology that do not yield nuclear weapons, light water reactors. However, they also understood that the only way that the U.S. could take them seriously is if they develop something of a strategic value for the United States and for Japan and the countries of the region, but most particularly for the United States. They knew that the history of the U.S., relations with the small nations like them, insignificant nations with not a big GNP, they have to develop a strategic asset that is of enormous importance to the U.S. in order for the U.S. to negotiate and take them seriously. They thought of nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons, since the U.S. is the guarantor, or NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it comes from the U.S. and it's been arranged and supported and defended by the U.S. in forums all over the world. So they felt this is a winning. However, they're underestimating the reaction from the U.S. and the reaction from forces within the U.S. and South Korea who hate them with passion, more than they hated Vietnam and China and Russia. They had hated North Korea. I had seen it between Republicans and Democrats, the raw contempt that they had for that regime, for the dynasty of the Kims. The mistakes of North Korea that are similar to the mistakes of other communist countries, other totalitarian regimes, have been enlarged and exaggerated and dwelt upon by the U.S. and South Korea. So it was in that environment that they signed their agreements in 1994, in October 21st, 1994, for the denuclearization of the peninsula. In other words, in which North Korea basically gave up the nuclear weapons program. However, the conditions for that was that the U.S. will establish soon diplomatic relations. The U.S. will remove the sanctions against them that gave them enormous economic burdens, that they will be removed from the list of a nation sponsoring terrorism. In other words, there were a series of commitments that the U.S. made that were supposed to match the commitments that they made. Unfortunately, we had a Republican Congress, and the Republican Congress, more than the Democratic executive, had incredible difficulties with that treaty and in dealing with North Korea, because their vision has been, you don't reward the enemy, you don't deal with the enemy, you don't negotiate with the enemy. They have a very narrow view of how to deal with enemies. Basically, if the enemy is small and weak, you whack them. If the enemy is big and powerful like the Soviet Union, you negotiate. So this is what had happened with North Korea. In the meantime, the South Korean regime had no interest in seeing a North Korea becoming friend or establishing diplomatic relations with the U.S. because they have, the South Koreans traditionally have sacrificed their relations with the North for domestic political consumption. The perversion of the politicians in South Korea was such that they always sacrifice their relations for purely political maneuver, political interest in South Korea. Besides, the South Korean elite had so much hatred and resentment towards North Korea that they could not be clear in the benefits of a rapprochement. They were never clear on the benefits of warming relations. They could not conceive that. They had so much hatred. And that hatred was matched by the hatred of the Republicans here in the United States and the hatred of scholars and intellectuals and so forth. So the treaty was bound to collapse. So what happens is that the U.S. did not meet their specifications for all kinds of excuses. And to my knowledge, the North Koreans waited until 1997. From 1994 to 1997, basically 3 years, they were waiting In 1997, they decided, aha, what the U.S. wants is our strategic asset, the only card that we have for them to take us seriously. They knew then, as they know now, that the key for reforms, the reforms that Kim Il-sung wrote down, the commitments that Kim Il-sung made to restructure the economy, that none of that could happen without revisiting the relations with the U.S., establishing a new dynamics with the U.S., more positive with the U.S. So they realize what the U.S. wants is to take away the only thing that we have to be taken serious, to sit down with them to negotiate. So they said, we're not going to do it. So they restart the processing of uranium in 1997. Of course, the international community is not aware of these things. It's easy to hate North Korea. It's very easy. And it's easy to blame it all on North Korea. But in this sense, both are guilty. Both. But especially the most guilty is the people who could not see the value of engaging both countries, putting aside the historical hatreds and the historical resentments, as valid as they may be, but especially on the part of the United States. The U.S. could not live up to their values, being a powerful nation that with the cooperation of South Korea and Japan and Russia and China could guide that nation towards reforms. They decided to give ultimatums and give deadlines and threats. Those things never work. They didn't work with Cuba. They didn't work with Saddam Hussein. They didn't work with Khomeini. They don't work. But there are people that are obsessed with that particular way of dealing with international...
Heavy-handed approach.
Yes, with international adversaries, particularly when the adversary is on the lower rank.
Yes. Okay, very clear. Thank you. You just mentioned the members of the SixParty Talks. Why has it become necessary to conduct negotiations with North Korea inside the framework of the SixParty Talks? And do you believe that such talks will eventually succeed in resolving the nuclear standoff with North Korea?
If the North Koreans will negotiate directly with the U.S., there will be nobody to verify it.
Right.
Now they're a witness.
Yes.
Whatever is agreed upon there, they will be witness. So people have to be forced to comply. In other words, what happened in 1994, if after they negotiated this agreement in 1994, had started a six-party talks in which this agreement will be not ratified, but agreed upon all the interested parties, the nations involved in Northeast Asia, I assure you that the onlookers, the witness, will make sure that the North Korea and the U.S. will comply. That is something positive. There are other things that are very positive about the six-party talks. The North Koreans finally, they realize that they have to somehow agree with this, otherwise they're not going to go anywhere. And the Bush administration is now 2 years away from ending. Mm-hmm. They are more willing to consider the value of diplomacy. They are in the process of assigning, following the U.S. Congress request, mm-hmm. to assign a negotiator or a high-level official that will represent the administration before the DPRK, the North Koreans. So there are things that are happening now that they were not there 2 years, 3 years, 8 years ago, 10 years ago.
Very good, thank you. Do you think the United States is prepared to offer any incentives to North Korea in exchange for them abandoning their nuclear weapons program?
I don't think they're ready to give anything, to tell you the truth. but they have to.
Mm-hmm.
The contempt that the U.S. has for North Korea is so deep that they're not contemplating giving them nothing. But they have to. They have no choice. They have to come to a more rational approach with the support, not alone, but with the support of the other five countries, players in the SixParty Talks.
Okay, thank you. Under what circumstances would North Korea be willing to abandon its nuclear program? And given their deceptive tactics in recent years, can the United States ever create conditions in negotiating with North Korea where they could actually trust the North Koreans?
My experience is and this is the experience of other experts that I talk with regularly. If we leave them alone, no. They need people like me. They need organizations like UPF, the Universal Peace Federation. They need institutions, think tanks, that are willing to consider, the role of dialogue, the role of serious, sincere negotiations. Of course, with the elements of verification to make sure that there is no cheating and there is no lying and there is no fault. I believe that this is possible. It can be done. And organizations like UPF and other organizations, the Women's Federation for World Peace, have to play an important role with the Heart of the Mothers. This is an organization founded by Reverend Moon. The Youth Federation for World Peace has a role also to play in North Korea. The World Culture and Sport Festival, it should also play a role also with North Korea. We can be, as I said before, true peacemakers, unifiers and harmonizers.
Okay, great. Thank you. In what way could President Bush increase the odds of achieving a breakthrough in the nuclear stalemate if he were to respond to the mandate of Congress to appoint a North Korean policy coordinator that you mentioned earlier, and go even one step further, for example, appointing former Presidents Clinton and Bush Sr., his father, to work together as special envoys, senior envoys to North Korea?
He has nothing to lose. He's not looking for re-election. They already lost, the Congress.
Yes.
They lost the Congress, they lost the Senate. So he has to show something at the end of his administration. He cannot afford to be just the one who sold out, who gave the Congress and the Senate to the Democrats.
For the sake of his own legacy.
Of his own legacy, he should consider other alternatives, such as appointing a serious policy negotiator and agreeing in something that will move this country from where it is to where it should be. But it cannot be by regime change. That is too dangerous. A regime change in North Korea right now is not desirable. The first ones who will tell you the irrationality of that particular position is South Korea. And so will be with China and Japan. They don't want a regime change, an abrupt regime change. Yes, you can have a regime change, but allow them a soft landing. Create the conditions for a transformation of the country. He can afford it because he needs to show something positive. Divert the attention from all the negativity that has happened in the last 4 years. And for God's sake, bring something positive into the table. He can never be remembered as a great president just because he fought all the evils of the world, no matter how real they were, but because he solved the problems. And the North Korean problem is there for him to resolve, hopefully, in these next 2 years before he leaves. He has nothing to lose.
Okay, very clear. Thank you. In your opinion, is the North Korean regime in a position to imagine a viable future for its people built on mutual trust in peaceful cooperation and coexistence with the international community? In other words, is it within Kim Jong-il's power to be able to take the kind of bold and decisive steps necessary, similar to what Mikhail Gorbachev did at the end of the Cold War, which transformed him from being a hated enemy into an international hero overnight, someone admired for his courage and leadership by people everywhere?
That is something that has to be built by the U.S. and its allies. That is something that has to be constructed. Right now, no. North Korea is not in the position to play that kind of a role. They are just defending themselves for what they perceive to be this superpower who wants to destroy the regime. For North Koreans, the most important thing right now is regime survival, which means the survival of the dynasty of the Kim and the children and grandchildren of the revolution. As much as we may disagree with that, that's what it is. That's why they allocate the best of whatever comes there to feed the military, because the military is responsible for the survival of the regime. Let's not, people get delusions and they complain, oh, why should we help them? Why should we feed them? They're going to feed the military. What do you expect? Huh? They're not in the business to feeding the entire population and in the process the regime collapse. That's not the way regimes function, either whether they be the United States or any regime in the world. This idea that countries like North Korea and other countries have to act in transparency, with purity, with dignity and love for their people is nice rhetoric, but it's not true, and the history of the countries of the world tell us that is not true.
It doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way. Mm-hmm. Well, it's good to create tensions and to keep the tensions high to obtain other objectives. Uh-huh. You know, you need an enemy in Northeast Asia to fulfill other objectives.
Okay. Very interesting. Dr. Betancourt, we've come to the end of our time for this interview. I want to thank you so much for being our guest today. I'm really grateful for the insights that you share with us based on your real-world experience. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you for inviting me, and this particular show is quite interesting.
Yes, it was for me too. Thank you so much.
Defining moments.
Yes, surely, thank you. You've been watching The Defining Moment for Creating a Culture of Conscience. You can find us on the internet at www.definingmoment.tv. Thanks for watching and have a great day.